Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video tutorial, I am going to go over the div block and the Flexbox container in the new Elementor v4. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is the div block and the Flexbox. Although these are two different elements, they're basically utilizing the exact same container system. They just have different default presets. So what do I mean by that? If I take a div block and drag that into my page and go to layout, you can see by default it's set to div block, but I can easily convert it to a Flexbox by clicking here on Flexbox. It's the same thing as dragging a Flexbox container element into your page. So if I drag a Flexbox into my page and go to layout, you can see it's automatically on Flexbox by default, but I can easily convert it to a div block by clicking on block. So regardless of which element you drag into your page, you can always toggle between one or the other. So the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the div block and what it is and when you should use it. So I'm going to drag a div block onto my page. So basically a div block, what it is it's a very generic, it's a very basic container, and you have very limited control over how the elements appear in that container. So by default, anything that you put into a div block is going to stack vertically. So if I take a heading widget, a paragraph widget, and a button, you can see how all these elements are stacking vertically. And this is because if I hover over each element, like the heading, you can see how we have this pink outline that extends all the way across the entire page. This is basically forcing the next element, which is the paragraph widget, to go onto its own separate line. And then this button right here, notice if I click on the button, the pink outline just wraps around the button. It doesn't extend out all the way. So if I was to drag another button into this container, notice it doesn't stack vertically. It's actually going inline or inline block. So by default in Elementor, buttons are using inline block styling. So if I click here on this button and go to style and go to layout, you can see it's on inline block. Inline block just means side by side with the element right next to it. So if I change it from inline block to block, now the elements are being stacked vertically. Now, as I mentioned earlier, anything that you place into a div block by default gets stacked vertically. You can still have the elements go across or side by side. What you would need to do is ensure that all of the elements within the div block are using inline block styling. So if we click here, for example, on the heading widget, go to style, go to layout, and set the heading widget to inline block. Now notice now the pink outline only wraps around the heading widget. It doesn't go all the way out. So this means the next element, if we set it to inline block as well, now it's automatically side by side. And then this button here, we just need to click on this one and set it to inline block as well. Now all of our elements for the div block are in a row. But you don't have much control over like setting a gap. If I was to make this container here, the main container, change it from a div block to a Flexbox, you can see down here we have an option called gap. So I can put like 20 pixels of spacing in there, and now each element automatically gets 20 pixels of spacing, or I can make it 50. So when you're using a Flexbox container, you have more control over the direction and the order of your elements. So by default, this Flexbox container is going in a row. I can reverse the row. I can put it in a column. I can reverse the column. I have a lot more control and flexibility when using a Flexbox. Now, if I go back to using a div block, I don't have any option to put a gap between my elements. But that doesn't mean that I can't put a space. I would do it a different way. So instead of using a gap, I would use either margin or padding. So if I click on this heading widget here and go to spacing, unlink the margin values and set a right margin of, let's say, 20, you can see now there's a little bit of spacing between the heading and the paragraph widget. So now if I click on this paragraph widget, go to spacing and unlink the margin values and put 20, I now have 20 pixels of spacing between the paragraph widget and the button. So basically, a div block is best used only when you have like one element. If you're just putting an image or a button inside of a container, a div block is perfect. You can wrap that element in a div block, but when you need more control over the layout of your elements, then a Flexbox container makes the most amount of sense. Now, right in this layout section here, if you click this arrow, there's another option called Inline Flex, which I'm going to talk about next. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a Flexbox container onto my page, and I'm going to give it a background color of blue, just so we can have a little bit of a visual reference of what we're doing. And in this Flexbox, I'm going to put a heading in here. I'm going to put a button, and I'm going to put a paragraph widget. So I got 3 elements in my Flexbox container. You can see I have it set to flex. Now, if I come over here to this little down arrow and change it to Inline Flex, notice between Inline Flex and Flex, nothing is happening. And if I change this to Block and then switch it to Inline Block, notice Block and Inline Block, nothing is happening. And then Flex to Inline Flex, nothing is happening. But there is a difference. So first, what I'm going to explain is Inline Flex. Inline Flex is going to take up the required amount of space that it needs. So in other words, this container right now is going all the way across. When you're using Inline Flex, this container should be pulled in and should come right up to where the end of this button is. And it's only going to take up the required amount of space that it needs for the elements, whereas Flex is going to take up the full width, which is what it's doing right now. So nothing is happening when we change it to Inline Flex. So what we need to do in Elementor is we need to come down to where it says size, and we're going to change the width. We need to change the unit from pixel to auto. Now notice what happens with this container. It's now, the Inline Flex is now hugging the contents within the container. So if we come back up here and go to Flex, now Flex is taking up the full width as it should be doing, and Inline Flex is taking up just the required amount of space that it needs for the elements within that container. Now if I go to Block, notice how Block is taking up the full width, and then if I change it to Inline Block, now it's taking up just the required amount of space that it needs to fit those items. All right, and then one last thing that I want to point out is if I take a Flexbox container, drag that into my page, I'll just put a background color. We'll go with like a dark gray. If I close this preview pane here, you can see how this container is taking up the full width. But maybe for your design, you want it to be boxed in and you want it to maybe line up with your header. So like in my case here, I want this container to kind of match the same width of my container. Now, I already know this container that I'm using up here is using about 1200 pixels. The container is about 1200 pixels wide. So if you want your container to line up with your header, you can just set a specific width for the container. So just click on the 6 dots for the container, go to size, and where it says width, change it to 1200. At least in my case, I'll go with 1200 since that's what my header is using. Now you can see that we have the container boxed in as opposed to full width. So I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this.